Egypt, land of the pharaohs. Welcome, class. Today we are going to be focusing on one of the most dynamic civilizations of the ancient Near East, Egypt. A civilization with thousands of years of history, spanning from the end of the Neolithic in through the Bronze Age. So without further ado, let's begin the exciting saga of the civilization on the Nile. So, for your first do now, the Nile River flows north. What local river also flows northward? Take a few minutes to answer that question, and then we will proceed with the rest of the lesson. So, the Nile River. Now, rich silt deposits make the Nile Delta ideal for farming. If you look at the map included on this slide and in your handouts, you will notice that there is a green area around the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta is the point at which the Nile River makes contact with the Mediterranean Sea. This area is a lush land, good for farming. As a result, as early as 4,400 BCE and earlier, human beings began to settle in the fertile Nile River Valley and the Nile River Delta. And here they began to establish kingdoms, began forming the basis of the civilization that we will soon call Egypt. So Egyptian unification. So when Egypt first begins to coalesce, we have two kingdoms. One in the south, referred to as Upper Egypt, and one in the north, referred to as Lower Egypt. These terms upper and lower may seem reversed to us, but this has to do with the fact that Upper Egypt is upriver and is geographically on a higher altitude than Lower Egypt, even though Lower Egypt is north of Upper Egypt. Now, Lower Egypt was wealthy due to the fertile Nile Delta, which, as you saw on the previous slide, is ideal for plant growth. So they had a lot more farming land and, as a result, more money. Now, both areas are unified under the pharaoh Narmer. And it's the palette of Narmer that can be seen on the right side of the page in the lower right-hand corner. The palette itself displays Narmer holding a war club and wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. On the right of the first part of the palette, which I'm going to be circling here with my mouse, you will see over here, this crown here with the papyrus scrolls is meant to represent Lower Egypt, which is now under Narmer's control. Now, during this period, the dead are buried in rock tombs called mastabas. Mastabas were small one-story chapels, basically, that were built in the desert to house the bodies of the deceased. Now, in the main entry to the mastaba, you'd have a chapel, a little shrine, with an offering table and a statue of the deceased. Behind that, though, there was a shaft which was sealed off. And at the bottom of the shaft, there would be a chamber containing the body of the deceased. So, the Old Kingdom of Egypt. Old Kingdom is the first of several periods we will refer to in Egyptian history. Old Kingdom Egypt defines Egypt beginning around 2700 BCE and ending around 2055 BCE. Now, the pharaohs of this period ruled from the city of Memphis. Now, it's during this time that the pyramids are built under the direction of the royal architect Imhotep, who not only built the pyramids as perfect geometrical pyramids, but also aligned them with the constellations. The Great Pyramids of Giza are aligned both with the dog star Sirius and with the North Star. Now, at that time, the North Star was part of the constellation Draco, the dragon constellation in the night sky. Now, the reason for this shift is that the Earth is not actually perfectly spinning on its axis, as you might have seen in second grade science class. Rather, it wobbles ever so slightly, and as time went on, that wobbling eventually caused the situation to be such that the North Star is now Polaris, but in the old days it was part of Draco. Now, the pyramids were built of limestone, and each of the blocks of the pyramid was about as heavy as a small elephant. Now, it was actually not built by slaves. Slaves are actually not a very dependable workforce for things of this nature, which often required a certain amount of skilled labor. people tend not to give their slaves as many skills. It's not always as productive. Skilled slaves are going to become more part of Egypt's labor repertoire as we get closer to New Kingdom Egypt. During this time, it was built by farmers during the off-season. And it is the separation of Upper and Lower Egypt that marks the end of the Old Kingdom. Mummification. So during pre-dynastic times, the dead were buried in the ground. So they just took a hole in the ground, and they buried their dead in the desert. Now the sand dried out the body and naturally mummified it, causing the skin to, instead of decaying, to be naturally preserved. Now, when later mastabas and other rock tombs are first built, they get damp inside, and this damp interior leads to decomposition. Fearing that this would have some negative impact on the deceased, the Egyptians began a process of a deliberate mummification, in which the internal organs are removed. The heart, lungs, liver, kidneys are preserved in canopic jars. The rest of the body is dried with salt, except for the brain, which is pulled out through the nostril via a hook. Once the body is thoroughly dried out, it is then wrapped in bandages. Small amulets are then placed in between the bandages, which were meant to protect the dead on their journey to the underworld, the next life. Now, the dead were usually buried inside elaborate coffins called sarcophagi or sarcophagi in the plural. Sarcophagi would fit inside each other, sort of like Russian nesting dolls, creating a layered coffin. Now, it's also interesting to note that this process of mummification would have some negative ramifications in that because precious stones were often put in these amulets, when people would rob tombs, they would often cut open the mummies of the dead in order to steal these amulets. In fact, in 19th century Europe, there used to be a thing called mummy parties, where wealthy individuals would buy an Egyptian mummy and then they and their guests would unwrap the bandages, and it was sort of a fun parlor game to see who could get what amulet or trinket that was buried with the deceased. Religion. So the Egyptians are polytheistic. They worshipped a pantheon of many gods, which was headed by their sun god. They actually had several sun gods, including Ra, and then also there was another important sun god known as Amun. Now, the Egyptian gods were somewhat fluid, so you could actually have cases where multiple gods might be combined. So at certain points we hear references to Amun-Ra, but in others we hear references to Ra-Harakadi. So there is a certain degree of fluidity. So these gods could often be meshed together or taken apart, depending on the state of the religion at the time. So that's a rather interesting component of their religiosity. They also believed in the 5 parts of the soul: the Ba, the Ka, the shadow, the name, and the heart. So the basic idea is that it was the one of these, your heart was part of your soul, as your shadow, your name. That's why having a name recorded was very important to the Egyptians. The Ba and the Ka, one of these would stay inside the pyramid, inside your tomb, and would live and would benefit from whatever was inside the tomb, while the other would fly into the sky to join the sun god Ra as the boat that was the sun sailed across the sky, and then in his journey through the underworld. Now, it's very interesting to note that the Egyptians believed in an afterlife in which the righteous dead would go on to live in paradise with Osiris and the gods. However, there's a catch. See, unlike most religions, there was a concept of a second death. You could be killed in the afterlife, and the way this happened was if you were forgotten entirely. So as a result of this, this is why you'll see a lot of tombs where people's enemies have deliberately defaced the tombs to destroy images of them and of the name of this person, in an effort to erase them from history and kill them in the afterlife. So Middle Kingdom Egypt, beginning around 2050 BCE and continuing up to around 1800, maybe 1750 at the latest BCE. And it's during this period that Egypt is reunified. Thebes is established as a more important city than Memphis and eventually does become the capital. And the period ends with the Hyksos invasion. So, the Hyksos period. So the Hyksos were Canaanite invaders. They come from Canaan, what we would now call Israel, Palestine, that area. That's where these people came from. They spoke a Bronze Age dialect of Hebrew. Now, Hyksos means kings of foreign lands in Egyptian. It does not mean shepherd kings, as Flavius Josephus stated. A lot of early books will describe Hyksos as meaning shepherd kings. It does not. Now, what gave the Hyksos their ability to conquer Egypt was their employ of two-man horse-drawn chariots. So each of these chariots was a two-wheeled, one-axle variety, which is different than the two-axled, four-wheel variety that we saw in Mesopotamia. And each chariot would have a driver, whose job it was to actually drive the chariot, and an archer, whose job was to fire a bow at people and kill enemy soldiers via archery. Now, the Hyksos founded several petty kingdoms, several small kingdoms in Lower Egypt, in northern Egypt. Now, the native Egyptian pharaohs were pushed south to the city of Thebes. So you have the native Egyptian Theban pharaohs in the south, and a series of smaller petty kingdoms, each ruled by Hyksos pharaohs in the north. And this characterizes the Hyksos period. So, rise of the new kingdom. So the Theban pharaohs eventually learned to adopt the Hyksos chariot, as depicted in the upper left corner. Now, in 1550 BCE, they expel the Hyksos, driving them back into Canaan through the Sinai Peninsula. Now, at this point, Egypt is reunified, and this is when the 18th dynasty comes into being. Now, Egypt reached its farthest extent under the pharaoh Thutmose III, and it stretched as far south as the 12th cataract of the Nile, all the way up into the Levant, all the way up into what we would now call Syria. And so that entire stretch from what we would now call Ethiopia and Sudan, all the way up to modern-day Syria, was all Egypt, back when Thutmose III was reigning pharaoh. So, New Kingdom tombs. Now, by this point, it had become obvious to a lot of people that pyramid tombs were too easy to rob. A large pyramid is basically a giant advertisement, come here and rob my stuff. And grave robbers would routinely break into these tombs in an attempt to steal treasure. So New Kingdom pharaohs would build massive temples in their honor, such as the one at Abu Simbel, which Ramesses II will build, as we get later on to the New Kingdom period. But at this time period, what they then do is they build hidden, smaller tombs in the Valley of the King on the west bank of the Nile. And that's where the pharaohs themselves would actually be buried, in a much more clandestine location, where it was not as easy for grave robbers to find the tomb. So, Hatshepsut. Now, Hatshepsut is remarkable because she is a female pharaoh. In fact, during her lifetime, she was given the title of the daughter of Horus. So this gets into a rather interesting facet of the Egyptian religion. In the Egyptian religion, each pharaoh was not the father of his own children. Rather, each Egyptian pharaoh is the child of Horus. So what this means is they believed that Horus, the god of pharaohs, the first pharaoh, would come and would actually have relations with the wife of the reigning pharaoh, and the child of Horus and the current pharaoh's wife would be the next pharaoh. That was how they conceived the world. And so the title daughter of Horus is a title which gives Hatshepsut a great deal of legitimacy. Now, she began her reign as her son's regent, meaning She was originally supposed to rule until he was too